meeting with a roll call, and then we'll move into the business portion of the meeting.
Hi, this is Bridget Koski, and I'm going to do the roll call. Is that okay?
Yep.
Mary Liz Hobart.
Here.
Peter Bell.
Here.
Patrick Bourne.
Here.
Jay Cole.
Here.
James Hovland. James Hovland. Elizabeth Kautz. Douglas Loon.
Here.
Mary Jo McGuire.
Here. Here.
Kanai Sabja.
Here.
George Schumber.
Here.
Aline Faramont.
Here.
Tom Weaver.
Here.
Janet Williams. Janet Williams. I think I saw she was on, but I didn't hear her.
She was?
Pahua Yang Hoffman. Pahua Yang Hoffman. And Jerry Zhao.
Here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, I'm not sure what that feedback is, but let's everybody mute if you're not presenting. So at this point, I'll mute, and Deb Dyson from Minnesota House of Representatives, House Research Department, is going to start with a presentation on the historical background of the Met Council and state and federal statutory responsibilities. And I don't know if you've kept track how many times you've given this presentation. I know I've lost track on how many times I've listened to you give this presentation. So I'm glad to have you here. And there's always a new twist as things evolve with this organization and process. So we're grateful that you're willing to help us today with this presentation. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'm hearing an echo when I talk, so I hope the audio is working okay. Good afternoon, Madam Chair. It's good to see you again. Members of the committee, I'm Deborah Dyson, a legislative analyst in the Nonpartisan House Research Department. And since 1991, one of my subject areas has been metropolitan government, including the Met Council. And I was asked to give some historical background or context for the work that you have before you. I sent to Judd Chutnan a 3-page outline of what I hope to cover, and I hope you got it. I don't have any PowerPoints, so sorry about that. The governor's executive order establishing the Blue Ribbon Committee states that the committee is to review the role of elected versus appointed Metropolitan Council members, the Met Council's role as the MPO, and the effectiveness and delivery of regional services. I wanted to start first by just doing a real quick outline of the current status of the Met Council, because I know you'll get more information on that, but sort of set the stage for where it is right now. As established in statute, the Met Council is a political subdivision of the state with jurisdiction in the 7 metropolitan counties, with exceptions for certain communities that have grown into the metro area from outside of it. It has 16 members appointed by the governor from districts that they serve, and then a chair appointed by the governor from the region at large. And all of the members serve at the pleasure of the governor. The area includes approximately 181 cities and towns plus other special purpose districts. And what I think is also very significant, 56% of the state's population lives in the metropolitan area. The council is a planning and coordinating agency, including its role in adopting long-term policy and regional system plans that inform local government land use planning, as well as investment in regional systems. It owns and operates regional transit and wastewater treatment infrastructure services, and provides funding or pass-through funding for housing that includes the Metro HRA, parks and open space, and the Metropolitan Livable Communities programs. So, and the reason I wanted to give that overview is that because transportation is the focus of this Blue Ribbon Committee, and it's a very significant and important function of the council and has been a source of a lot of controversy in recent years, it's not the only council function to take into consideration when you're looking at the council's governance structure. So for history, I go back to 1957, to be honest. 1957 was when the legislature created the original Metropolitan Area Planning Commission. And the legislative findings for that stated that metropolitan area, there was urban growth and development, problems have arisen and will arise which so transcend the boundary lines of local government units that no single unit can make plans for their solution without affecting other units in the area, and that comprehensive planning for the orderly and economical growth of the entire metropolitan area, consistent with general welfare, requires the establishment of a regional planning commission. And so the commission was established. The statute at the time was kind of flexible on how many members, so there were at least 28 members, and depending on which counties joined this planning commission jurisdiction, there might have been more. But the power of that entity was to make suggestions for development of the region. It had no real authority. As the region grew, there was more and more concern with development that had impacts beyond individual local government boundaries. And this was particularly true with regard to wastewater. In the 1960s, the communities in the metro area had grown so that what one city did upstream had the potential for adverse impacts on cities downstream. Minneapolis and St. Paul had the sewer board that had been created in 1933 and had sewage treatment facilities, but the suburbs that were growing did not, and the increasing density was resulting in septic contamination of home water wells. And also at the time, there were some northern suburbs that wanted to build a sewage treatment plant, but the effluent would have been discharged too close to the Minneapolis water intake. So when I went into the Historical Society and looked at old newspaper clippings and did research on this when I first started working in house research, it seemed like everybody was saying we need a regional solution. In addition to the wastewater issues, there were this is a period of time when the highway and the freeways were being expanded, and there were several privately owned bus lines that were in decline and going into bankruptcy. The third thing that seemed to always come up in the literature of the time is that federal programs at this time were encouraging regionalism, and that federal funding programs required all applications for federal loans or grants for open space land projects, hospital planning and construction, airports, libraries, water supply and distribution systems, sewage systems, the land conservation. They all had to be submitted to a designated area-wide planning agency. This came to be known as the A95 clearinghouse review process. So with the apparent need for better coordinated planning and implementation of infrastructure on a larger regional scale, and the federal requirement for regional planning agency to review applications for federal funds, the question at the time was not whether to establish some kind of agency with more power, but what kind of regional agency. And that's where the debate over the elected versus appointed first started coming up, as far as I can tell. The proponents of the different council formations used a functional analysis to determine how to structure the council, including how to select its members. The elected council plan that was proposed in the 65, 66, 67 period provided for a metropolitan service district as a public corporation and governmental subdivision of the state, a nonpartisan elected body of 15 members, and the council chair would be appointed by the council from among its members. The council would also appoint an executive director to serve as the administrative head for the agency. Under the elected council proposal that was considered at the legislature in 1967, the council was directed to establish an operating department for each service or function it was directed or to provide or perform. The council was directed to plan and coordinate the physical, social, and economic development of the metropolitan area, including but not limited to things like sewage, transit, garbage disposal, highways, public transportation in general, parks, open space and recreation, drainage and water supply, air and water pollution, hospitals, libraries, schools, law enforcement, property tax assessments, planning and zoning. It was a very broad selection of powers and duties that this elected Met Council would have. It also included apparently mosquito control, even though there was already a mosquito control district and commission in existence at that time run by the counties. In contrast, the appointed council plan provided for the governor to appoint members to serve at large on a nonpartisan basis. The appointed council would have been responsible for planning and coordinating the operation of any state-created regional agency, but the council was not given operating powers. The council was directed to coordinate preparation and adoption of the development guide, review and approve or disapprove local government long-range plans, and conduct federal program reviews, collect data, do research, and then in addition, council members would serve in a non-voting capacity on any other regional agencies, such as the Airports Commission, the Mosquito Control Commission, the Sewer Board, etc. So to summarize, if the council was going to have a planning and operating duties and provide direct services traditionally provided at the local level by an elected body of local government officials, the legislature was looking at the model then that felt that the council should be elected as well. In contrast, if the council was going to be a coordinating and planning body, making recommendations to the legislature and the region for services and growth, then it was less important that it have direct representation of the electorate. And as you know, the appointed council was the one enacted. And the same year, 1967, the Metropolitan Transit Commission was created to take over the transit services of the region. And in general, the two were supposed to work together. So over the next several years, between 1967 and 1990, you have the legislature creating the Metropolitan Waste Control Commission in 1969 as the implementing agency, and it was to take over what was then the Sewer Board and to expand the system and services. Oddly enough, even though your duties relate specifically to the MPO, I forgot to put in the creation of the MPO, but in 1973, the Governor Wendell Anderson sent a letter to the federal agency designating the Metropolitan Council as the MPO for the region and establishing what then was codified the next year in 1974, the Transportation Advisory Board to provide for the council to serve that function as MPO. Also in 1974, you have the creation of the Metro HRA, which was developed at the legislature at the request of the suburban communities that did not want to administer the HRA programs and wanted the Met Council to handle the administration of that for them. Also was the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission that was established as an advisory body to the council for the regional park system. And it is pretty much the same as it has been. The regional park system was viewed as complementary to the state park system, and in the metro area, as you probably know, the parks and open spaces that are part of the regional system are actually owned and operated by the local government units in the metro area. In 1975, you have a major recodification of the statutes relating to all of metropolitan government. And I only mention that because if you're doing legislative history and you're looking at the statutes, the section at the bottom of each section that says what year it was enacted, they all say 1975. That's the year it was recodified, and you have to go back earlier than that to find some of the origins of the statutes. 1976 was another major year for metropolitan government with the enactment of the Metropolitan Land Planning Act that mandated local comprehensive planning in the metropolitan area and provided for the council's review of those local plans to ensure that local development and planning was consistent with regional plans, and in particular to protect the regional infrastructure investments that were being made. 1977, the Metropolitan Sports Facilities Commission was created and was trying to determine where to build the next major sports facility. That resulted in recommendations that ended up being the Metrodome, built in 1979. The Met Council had the requirement, the Met Council was the entity that issued the general obligation bonds to build the Metrodome, so that the Met Council had budget approval over the Sports Facilities Commission. In the 1980s, in order to have better coordination between the long-range policy plans and the implementation, the operating entities like the Waste Control Commission, and in Transit, they were directed in law to develop mid-range policy plans, implementation plans that were subject to council approval. In the area of transit at this time, the Regional Transit Board was established to develop mid-range implementation planning and to coordinate transit financing and services, which included approximately 30 providers, I think, with the suburban services, the opt-outs, the Metropolitan Transit Commission itself, and Metro Mobility. And the council appointed most of the Regional Transit Board members, who in turn appointed the Metropolitan Transit Commission. So in addition to the normal friction that you're going to have between agencies that are in a relationship like this, the public and elected officials were growing more and more concerned with the perceived lack of accountability for how the operations were handled. That is, these agencies were governed by appointees of appointees, and the appointees responsible for major systems were generally unknown and viewed as unaccountable for the quality of service and the use of public dollars. All of this led up to the 1990s, and in 92, in particular, there were many bills introduced at the legislature that were making changes to the Met Council's powers and duties and governance structure. In 1993, there were at least 5 major bills introduced, 3 that made governance, their structural changes, but also provided for an elected Metropolitan Council. 2 of the major bills retained the appointed council provision, but made other changes to the structure of the various subordinate agencies and the council, and in one case, I think, changed some of the powers and duties of local governments. So all of these were analyzed more or less the same way as it was in the 1960s, looking at what are the powers and duties that the council should have and how does that relate to the governance structure. In 1993, at the end of the session, there was no consensus on what should happen. And in the omnibus tax bill, which was the last bill enacted in 1993, at the very end of it, there was a state advisory council on metropolitan governance that was created to study this. And I believe Senator Carol Flynn was the author of that. And that was put in place in 93. It had 6 legislators and 9 public members to study and make recommendations on the proposals. It was chaired by Representative Myron Orfield and Senator Carol Flynn. And again, the civic organizations like the Citizens League, the League of Women Voters, all the local government associations, and the council itself were studying different options that were that they had come up with to make recommendations to the advisory council. The advisory council itself met through the summer and fall, and it was looking at all the demographic information related to the region and the forecasts, other models of regional government throughout the country and Canada, the role of local governments in providing services and land use, and then the current and likely future social and infrastructure issues that could be addressed by a regional body. Among them, always is transportation. And ultimately, the Advisory Council proposed legislation that would abolish the Metropolitan Transit Commission, the bus service, entity that provided the bus service, the Regional Transit Board, and the Metropolitan Waste Control Commission, and merge those functions and operations into the council. In addition, but it was not unanimous. In fact, I think it was very closely discussed at the advisory council level, was a determination to propose an elected council as the governance structure of the council itself. Finally, the last thing I often like to mention in a presentation like this is that in the fall of 1993, the new metro mobility system that was developed by the Regional Transit Board failed, leaving vulnerable people stranded, and the governor ended up calling out the National Guard to operate metro mobility that fall. This too gave a major impetus to making a change at the legislature. With that, in 1994, you have the Metropolitan Government Reorganization Act. The bill that was introduced abolished the subordinate agencies and made the council an elected body. And I was thinking of, anyway, so you have this, the bill went through all the committees. When it got to the House floor, it failed after a long debate, but it failed by one vote. It was quickly revised to leave the council as an appointed body, but with members serving at the pleasure of the governor. And my understanding has always been that the intent was to make the governor the one sole person accountable for all of the council's actions or inactions. The revised bill was taken up 3 days later and was signed into law. 1995 was another major year for the Metropolitan Council with the creation of the Metropolitan Livable Communities Act and major changes to the Metropolitan Land Planning Act that required review and updating of metropolitan comprehensive plans by the local governments every 10 years, and for the council to review and update systems plans and policy plans. The other thing that happened in 95 that the council had been very active in working on was the dual track airport planning process, and a decision was made on the airport in 95, and that process came to an end. Since 1995, there have been bills introduced most years to change the structure of the council, whether it's to abolish the council altogether, to study it some more, to make the council an elected body. There's always been ongoing controversy related to the council's governance structure and its powers and duties. I'll note that in 1997, there was a bill to make the council an elected body that actually passed the legislature, but at that time it was fairly well understood, I think, that the governor was going to veto it if it passed, and it was vetoed. More recently, for a number of years, there have been bills that focus on the staggering of terms. Since 1994, council members have served at the pleasure of the governor, meaning that there can be a whole turnover of all of the policy-making body whenever there is a new governor elected. The Metro Cities, I think, has been a major proponent of providing for staggering of terms as it was before 1994. A bill to do that has been passed at least twice and vetoed twice, once by Governor Pawlenty and once by Governor Dayton. So the last thing I wanted to mention in the presentation is a bill that was passed in 2018 that had been put together by some metro counties, and it was also vetoed by the governor. But it would have changed the size and structure of the council to consist of 29 members, most of whom would have served staggered terms and would have been local elected officials, 8 county commissioners and 16 city council members. The chair would have served as the 29th member appointed by the governor, and for purposes of the council's role as a metropolitan planning organization, the council would have included the Commissioner of Transportation and appointees representing transportation interests for the purposes of the MPO. And if it had been passed, it would have been effective for appointments made in 2019. But as I said, it was also vetoed. And I'm going to stop there. That's what I had prepared for you. And if you have questions, I will try to answer them. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dyson. Are there any questions on that presentation? Feel free to unmute yourself. Eileen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Dyson, for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. Could you talk a little bit about the role that the legislature plays in oversight of the council? I know there's a committee as well as, just in the overall budget, some of the appointments and funding?
Madam Chair, and members, well, the council was created by the legislature, and its powers and duties are in statute. So in terms of oversight, both the House and the Senate have committees, and I will say that back in the early 90s when I first started, there was in the House at least, I really can't speak to what the Senate does, so I'm not as familiar with their operations, but in the House there was a committee that was focused on metropolitan affairs, and it was a large committee and there was a lot of interest and discussion in it. Over the years that has changed, and at this time anything to do with metropolitan government in the House is somewhat fractured, with issues relating to parks going to in the Environment Committee, or issues relating to Met Council and Transportation or in the Transportation Committee. But there's no one committee that's sort of looking at the council as a whole. But the committees have that jurisdiction to look at proposals for changes, or to just hear the budgets. In 2001, there was a legislative commission on metropolitan government created to review and make recommendations on the council's budget and policy plans. And I'd say most years it meets at least once before the council's budget is adopted to hear a presentation on the council budget. But it does not have, it has as much authority by those members who serve on the commission for them as legislators to propose legislation arising out of that, but that commission itself can't make changes to law or tell the council what to do. All action by the legislature has to happen through the committee process, and action by the entire legislature, and then to become law, it has to be signed into law by the governor. But yeah, because this is an entity created by the legislature has a great deal of control. And so that's where the council's powers and duties come from. Does that answer your question?
I think that's helpful. I mean, I was just thinking just in terms of the role of, being able to approve potential appointees, and then it would be helpful to have clarification on the legislature's responsibility or role in any kind of bonding authority or levy amount.
I missed the last part of that, but the
Aline, this is Jim. Aline, your microphone isn't working that well. It's hard to hear you.
Yes.
The Senate has the confirmation process, and I was just going to quick check. It's been a while since I've looked at that, but I know it applies to the chair. I don't know off the top of my head if it applies to individual council members. I don't think so, but Judd is nodding his head.
It does.
For all members?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Like I said, when it's a Senate thing, I often just don't pay attention, and I should, but I don't always. So there's a confirmation process, and then yes, all of the council's taxing and levying authority is set in statute. It's an authority to, for example, issue bonds for transit. That's set. There's a cap in statute for that. A long time ago, one of the questions I got from a legislator is, how can an unelected body be imposing taxes and issuing debt? And I heard words like taxation without representation, and I had to explain that the representation is the legislature. The legislature is the entity that makes the decision about what is the maximum amount of levy, what can levies be used for, how much debt can the council issue, and and what is that for? And the legislature exercises that authority.
Deborah, this is Jerry. Can I have a follow-up budget question?
Right.
Yep. The question is, in the council's budget, what's the roughly, what's the share of the money that's generated locally? What's the share of the federal part? And has that percentage changed substantially over the years?
And Jerry, we're going to have some presentations by Met Council staff, so maybe they can address that as we move forward.
Yeah, that's what I was going to recommend. I'm not prepared to go into details on things like the budget.
We will cover that in our slides coming up right after Deb's presentation.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Ms. Dyson? Raise your hand or unmute. Mayor Williams.
I just had a question or a comment in the background history that we received ahead of time. It seems that some of the details that you had mentioned were not in there. So would we get a copy of what you presented today?
Hi, everybody. I did send that information that Deb, her outline to everyone today. I don't have the verbatim rundown of her comments, but we also have this being minutes being taken. We'll see how we potentially try to pull that together for folks to have.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say the only thing that that wasn't in the outline that I sent ahead of time that I added related to, oddly enough, the MPO creation. I forgot about, but otherwise I was mostly just talking.
All right, anything else for Ms. Dyson? So I think in around 2000, there was a bill that completely did away with the Met Council and any reference to it in any law or statute. And I think at that time, that bill was like 550 pages long. I wonder if you would take a gander 20 years later, how many more pages would be added to that bill to take Met Council completely out of the statutes.
It would be, it's a long bill because the council's functions are included in many other areas. The water statutes have reference to the council's functions. There's a lot of conforming language, let me put it that way. There was actually, and the bills to abolish the council show up often. 2000 isn't the only year that they've been out there. They don't necessarily get all of the attention to detail. The questions that come up are, if you're going to abolish the council, what do you do with everything? And somebody has to answer those questions. And often the people proposing to abolish the council are mad at it, but they haven't decided what happens with all the housing functions, what happens to the transit system, what happens to the waste control system. So there are a lot of issues that have to be addressed if somebody's going to go that route. The shortest version of an abolish the council bill that I ever saw was one page that said the council is abolished, and then it was set 4 years out, and somebody is designated, often it's the council itself, is designated to come up with a bill to deal with all of those questions. And if they don't, the Department of Administration has to take over everything. So, and that any outstanding debt of the council will be handled by the counties. It's remarkable what you can come up with if in drafting a bill, if you have to. So anyway, but it can be long, it can be short.
Yeah, just to make the point, it's a very complicated issue, and it's an organization that has been built with decades of layering. Another hand.
Madam Chair, quick question. Has there ever been in the history, I may have missed it in your presentation, but was there ever a governor that was a champion to change or maybe supportive of a switch to elected from selected?
Well, I was going to say yes until you got to the elected versus appointed. The 1994 bill. Was it Governor Carlson at that time? Anyway, definitely a champion of the changes being made. The governor's office was closely involved in the reorganization. The elected part, I don't think a governor has been interested in it ever. And I would also, I think one thing that I read a long time ago about the elected council thing is that legislators aren't all that keen on it. You end up with council districts, especially if you have 16 districts, you have council districts that are much larger than a state senate district. There's a feeling of, if you have over half the state's population in an elected body, that's sort of like a mini legislature. Even though its powers and duties are governed by the legislature, there creates a pretty serious tension there. So and campaign finance issues, they often have to be addressed in an elected council bill, because that would be an expensive campaign to run for a nonpartisan part-time position, So anyway, but a champion by a governor for an elected council, not that I'm aware of.
Commissioner McGuire.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just to follow up on what Aline had asked about, which was what the legislative involvement is here. What committee would a bill for Met Council governance be referred to now? When I was in the legislature, I was served on local government, so we did see this. But I haven't been following. What committee would it go into in the House and Senate? Because I know they have different committees too.
Madam Chair, in the last biennium in the House, it would have gone to government operations.
Okay. And in the Senate, has the same probably.
Yeah, they have a committee. But, everybody is up for election, and come January, the committee structure could be reorganized, and it's unclear. I think what would happen with anything that affects different subject areas like transportation, the governance thing would go one place, but it would also be looked at by committees that deal with transportation or with wastewater. Anything that affects the governance structure and how the council performs its powers and duties would end up going to those committees. But there hasn't been in the last biennium a committee that was dedicated to local and metropolitan government. So the State Government Operations Committee would have handled it this last biennium. But like I said, once there's an election and a reorganization of the House, you just have to wait for the committee structure to find out how it would be handled.
Thank you.
Okay, we sort of need to keep moving here. Any other quick burning questions? If not, Peter.
I have a question. Madam Chair, Ms. Dystrom, has there been much discussion that you could find about how council members were appointed? Not an elected versus appointed, but the process of appointing council members.
Madam Chair and members, yes. There's been a lot of discussion of that. And in the 1990s, there were changes made to the appointment process. There's an appointment committee that's established to go through people who've applied to be on the council and make recommendations to the governor. There have been proposals. Part of the staggered terms bill was to increase the feed into the appointment process by local governments. So there's a lot of that discussion of how that's done, but ultimately, if you give the governor the power of appointment, you can't limit who the governor appoints, except by the Senate confirmation process. So you can have a lot of input, you can put into law a lot of procedure for providing the advice and expanding the pool of people who are considered, but then ultimately the governor gets to make that decision, as long as you're giving the governor the power of appointment. One of the things that bill from 2018 changed was who was making the appointments.
All right. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Dyson. Appreciate the information. the expertise and all your efforts over the years. I'd like to say you've probably seen it all, but somebody will call me wrong here pretty soon. So just when you think you've seen it all, there's something new at the legislature. So anyway, thank you.
You're welcome.
Judd, so are we going to Lisa next or?
Madam Chair, we are. We'll move to Lisa Barajas, who's our Community Development Director. And we're going to move through here hopefully quickly with staff from 4 of our divisions that are going to give a brief outline of their responsibilities and how they deliver those statutory requirements as part of their division's work. And then the next piece will be a quick overview of what other regions do related to regional government, and then hopefully have time for some discussion at the end. So I'll stop here and Lisa will pick up. I believe she's ready to go.
And just to Jerry's prior question, as your director's report, if they could just give a brief overview of the percentage of funds fed versus state versus local. It doesn't have to be exact dollar amounts, but just a flavor of that, and we can get more detailed information for a future meeting.
And that sounds good. And what I'll do is get together a quick pie chart that I can send around to everybody that breaks down the divisions and then our overall budget, so people can see that as well. So I'll be working on that as people listen to these presentations.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Good afternoon, committee members. I'm Lisa Barajas, the Community Development Director. And because Deb Dyson did such a wonderful job at introducing, I think we should run through Community Development Division pretty quickly. Most of the items, next slide, please. Most of the items that were early responsibilities of the council on the regional planning side now live in my division in community development. So those regional planning functions around parks and trails, comprehensive plans, the development of the Metropolitan Development Guide, and the Livable Communities Act programs, in addition to the Metropolitan Housing and Redevelopment Authority. The council also is responsible and remains responsible for conducting research of significant regional issues, and have a lot of responsibilities that live in other statutes like the Metropolitan Agricultural Preserves Act, the Mississippi River Corridor critical area, and regarding fiscal disparities, where we're not the owner of those, but have responsibilities with other state agencies in implementing those programs. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the community development is responsible for coordinating the long-range planning efforts of the Metropolitan Council, and specifically to guide the growth and development of the region. We do this in cooperation with the planning staff and all of the other divisions as well, with community development staff specifically having the expertise around land use and housing, natural resources in particular. And of course, among all of the system plans that the council is responsible for, community development is responsible for the regional park system plan. And we also are responsible for the housing policy plan, which is not a system, but a policy that is developed to carry out our responsibilities under the Metropolitan Land Planning Act as it relates to planning for and providing housing in the region to serve the region's populations with low and moderate incomes. And next slide, thank you. As noted earlier too, over time, there's a number of statutes that guide our regional planning cycle, which are referenced on the lower left hand of the slide. But they lead both with a regional development guide, our responsibilities to develop as the council system and policy plans, and then to issue system statements. The Metropolitan Land Planning Act is specific about what goes into system statements, and in particular that it should represent for an individualized statement for every community in the metro area as it pertains to the council's plans and capital plans for the regional systems, as well as the forecasted growth expected for a given community. So this is essentially a promulgation of the regional plan and initiates the local planning process. And by law, we're required to issue those in the year of the decade ending in 5. So in 2015, in this last cycle, and the next cycle in 2025. And then local governments have 3 years to prepare and submit their local comprehensive plans in response to the regional development guide and system plans. The council then reviews those plans, and as is laid out in the Land Planning Act, we review those plans for conformance to regional regional system plans, consistency with regional policies, and then compatibility with the plans of adjacent and affected jurisdictions. So that includes all of the adjacent local governments, counties, cities, townships, and state agencies, watershed districts, park agencies, if they're different than the government that is preparing that plan, and ensuring that that compatibility exists. Initially in this in the planning process, there were a lot of compatibility issues, but over the decades of planning, those compatibility issues have really fallen, thankfully, to the wayside. Then all of that information is, of course, used to inform the next round of the Regional Development Guide, and that's about what we're about to enter into for the next 10-year planning cycle. Next slide, please. I apologize, that should not be there, but next slide, thank you. For regional parks, as Deborah Dyson mentioned, we are responsible both for developing the regional parks policy plan, but we do that in cooperation with the 10 regional parks implementing agencies who actually own and operate the components of the regional system. Now, while we do that on a 10-year cycle, state law also requires that we update this every 4 years. So we have some push-pull in there because it's only once every 40 years that those line up. But nevertheless, we are often working with our implementing agencies to update that plan and keep it in cycle and identify which parks and trails are part of the regional system. In addition, state law identifies our relationship with implementing agencies in the planning process. For every component of the regional parks and trail system, a master plan must be developed by the implementing agency and submitted to the council for review and approval before it can be implemented or receive any funding from state or regional funding sources. And then to the pass-through component that Deborah had mentioned as well, the council both distributes state funding from a variety of sources, whether it's state bonding, environment and natural resources trust fund dollars, or Parks and Trail legacy dollars, as well as contributes regional bonds to match those funding, state funding sources. And that is for operations, acquisition, and development projects in the system. Next slide. The Metropolitan Livable Communities Act program is another component of our regional planning department, and it's the funding arm, if you will. It represents a $20 to $25 million annual award program that is awards grants to local governments who participate and are eligible to participate in that program. State statute identifies what the eligibility criteria are for participation, and every 10 years, local governments are required to re-enroll, and we're right in the middle of that cycle right now. But Livable Communities Act programs, the 3 primary ones, the Livable Communities Demonstration Account, the Local Housing Incentives Account, and the Tax-Based Revitalization Account, were meant to meet these 4 primary criteria to create compact and connected development patterns, to help with the creation and preservation of living wage jobs, to create incentives to include a full range of housing opportunities across the region, especially in developing communities, and to preserve and rehabilitate affordable housing in the fully developed area. This program is entirely funded by the local tax levy, which is also the maximum amount is also set in statute. The tax-based revitalization account actually gets a maximum amount of $5 million a year through the fiscal disparities program legislation. Next slide, please. And then on our operational side, and I know it's referred to as a pass-through program, but we consider this our operational element because we work directly with 7,200 households in the region to provide rent assistance and help them find housing that meets their needs. As Deborah noted, this Housing and Redevelopment Authority was created in 1974, and we serve the largest geography of the region, representing all of Anoka and Carver County, all of suburban Ramsey County outside of the city of St. Paul, and most of suburban Hennepin County. There, in addition to Minneapolis, there are a handful of other cities that have their own housing authorities. This program is primarily a federally funded program. Most of our households, about 7,000 of them, are on the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is the federal program. But we also operate 9 other state-funded programs, whether it's for the Veteran Affairs program to help veterans find safe and affordable housing, or other types of programs that are funded by other state sources. But primarily, the federal program is the primary source of both voucher and rent assistance. And this is approximately a budget of $65 million a year, most of that being federal dollars, by and large, actually, federal dollars that support that program. In addition, the council owns and operates 150 housing units, 150 housing units, and uses federal vouchers to place low-income households within those 150 units around the region. Next slide, please. And then finally, our research. And I think that this is, while it is actually laid out in state statute in a number of places that are referenced below, our responsibilities lie both in forecasting population, households, and jobs, not just for the region, but for local governments, cities, townships, and counties. That information is used in regional planning, transportation modeling, local comprehensive plans, and a whole lot of other places that we see turn up, and sometimes in the newspaper too. Annual population estimates are another requirement in state law that we also provide and do on an annual basis. In addition, we are regularly, we're required to track on an annual basis the construction of affordable housing production across the region and by community. But just good planning says we should know what's actually happening in the region as regards development of construction, whether it's residential or non-residential, affordable or not, because it gives a clearer picture to all of us about what's occurring and whether our policies need to change, adjust, or adapt, or our grant programs need to change, adjust, or adapt. And finally, by law, we are also required to track the estimated usage of all of the regional parks and trails. A number of funding formulas are based off of the research that we do, including our parks funding. The population funding informs local street aid, calculations for fiscal disparities, et cetera. So to the earlier question from one of the committee members, we're about half and half. Locally funded and federally funded. And that's just in operations. I think I'd have to look a little bit closer when we are looking at our pass-through amounts because we pass through a lot of dollars, and that can vary from year to year if the state decides to award a large number of state bonds or a lower number of state bonds, and similar from other funding sources that can change. But all the big ticket items come from either state or from federal programs, and then our operations, our staff are about half and half federal and local support on our budget. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Any quick questions? Otherwise, we're going to keep moving here. Otherwise, we're never going to get through our agenda. Okay, I don't see any questions. I think, Nick, you're up next.
Thank you.
Correct?
Nick Thompson, I'm the Director of Transportation Services at the Council.
And if I might, both Nick and Wes, I was under the understanding that these were going to be like 5-minute presentations by each of you. So you're going to have to like speed it up. And at our next meeting, we're going to talk more about MPOs and we're going to get deeper into the transportation stuff. So if you hit this at a high level, if we miss something, we'll be coming back to it again at another meeting.
Right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
So our division has 3 functions. It's the MPO functions, which we'll get into more next week, our next meeting. And then we're responsible for transit operations in the region that are operated through contract. So separate from what Metro Transit does. And then we administer grants to locals. We have a budget of about $134 million per year. The vast majority of that is through transit operations. The planning function is federally funded up to 80%. Next slide, please. Our state laws, as mentioned, the State Land Planning Act. We also get into 4 different federal laws, as mentioned here on the screen. It's the Metropolitan Transportation Planning Act that's often the question around the MPO law, whether we're a valid MPO in the council, and that's the one we'll get into next time. Next slide. So our transportation planning is to look ahead 20 years in the comprehensive transportation planning that considers all modes in our region, including aviation. It's one of the 4 system plans. It provides guidance for regional transportation partners that are systems that are operated by many, not just transit and highways and bike and ped. And then it has to be consistent between regional plans and local plans. Next slide. So our transportation planning process, or the MPO process, is a continuous cycle. It starts with the long range transportation plan and state plans and system plans that I mentioned looks ahead 20 years. We update that now every 5 years at least. We do have a new transportation policy plan that will be approved and adopted within the next couple of months. It also is short-term investment plan, which is the transportation improvement plan, or TIP, which must include all transportation projects with federal funding. That's a 4-year look at transportation. And then we are also charged with monitoring and reporting performance of the transportation system. All of this must be in compliance for the region to spend on average over $500 million of federal funding per year. This cycle must be in federal compliance. Next slide. So one unique aspect of the MPO boundaries is they're defined as the urbanized area at a minimum. And this map, as you see, is the 7-county region represented by the Met Council. The urbanized area extends beyond the 7-county region to include the urban areas in Sherburne and Wright County. The boundaries of the MPO are updated every 10 years. And so after the next census is in, we expect another expansion of our urbanized area. It currently does include a portion of Wisconsin, also a very small portion near downtown Stillwater. The MPO as defined and that was created in the early 70s here is both the TAB, which several members of this committee are members of our Transportation Advisory Board TAB, which is a 34-member body that is a majority elected officials of county and city officials. It also represents all modes. So MnDOT has a chair, the council representing transit, suburban transit providers, and PCA and the airports. It also has citizen reps that represent the region geographically. So that member board works with the council to approve as the MPO for the region and approval of the transportation planning documents as described. Next slide, please. Just briefly on our transit services that I mentioned that are all ones that we operate on contract. We do operate some fixed route buses complementing Metro Transit. The bulk of our work is with our ADA, or for those with disabilities, our Metro Mobility Program, which is covered by both federal and state law. In our region, it is funded by general fund. This is a transit system funded by general fund. Transit Link allows us to have a transit service for the whole 7 counties for areas where there is no fixed route. And then we operate a Metro van pool program in the region. Next slide. In addition to operating the transit services, we provide regional services to other providers. We buy and own all the regional fleet for the suburban transit providers. We provide the technology to ensure seamless technology on things like fare collection for customers across all the transit system so that there's interoperability. We manage the grants as the grant holder for the suburban providers in U of M. We manage the regional policy and performance around transit. And then we support the providers as needed for any other services. And they were established in the early 80s, and we'll talk about that in the future. Next slide. This is just a quick slide about how transit ridership is distributed from 2019. Metro Transit provides the overwhelming amount of transit in the region. MTS is the 2nd largest provider, with most of that being, over half of that being Metro Mobility ADA rides. So that's the bulk of our ridership for the MTS transit services. And that concludes my slides. I'd take any questions.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Nick at this point? I don't see any. All right, thank you. Wes, you're up.
Thank you, Chair Holberg. I'll get right at it. Next slide, please. This map, in the white area, this map shows the service footprint of Metro Transit in the 7-county metro area. The footprint includes 907 square miles in 90 cities. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner, the North Star service extends beyond the 7-county metro area to Big Lake and in Sherburne County. The purple shaded areas of the map show the opt-out service areas. While Maple Grove is an opt-out service provider, it chooses to contract with Metro Transit to provide its transit services. On average, Metro Transit riders tend to be more diverse and have less income than the regional population as a whole. 41% of Metro Transit household and rider household incomes are under $35,000 per year, and 45% identify as Black, Indigenous, or persons of color, compared with 27% region-wide. Next slide, please. In 2019, 125 routes were used to provide our transit services. These included 51 urban core and supporting local routes, 10 suburban local routes, 61 express bus routes, Green Line and Blue Line light rail transit routes, and North Star commuter rail. Next slide, please. In 2019, we provided 77 million rides, with an average weekday ridership of 250,000 rides per day. The last travel inventory that was conducted in 2016 showed that approximately 60% of our rides are used for getting to work or school. There is significant variability in the work schedules of our riders, so many rides are provided, work rides are provided outside the typically considered 9 to 5 commute hours. In total, bus represents about 2/3 of our rides, and core, local, and suburban local bus routes represent between 75 to 80% of all bus rides. Light rail continues to increase in ridership and now represents about 1/3 of all our rides. And of course, in 2020, our ridership during the pandemic response is very, very different from 2019. Through August, our 2020 ridership was down 50%. This includes ridership in the pre-pandemic months of January and February, when we were outperforming 2019 ridership levels. Last month in August, our ridership was down 67%, and these ridership losses vary significantly across service types. In August, core and suburban local bus ridership was down approximately 50 to 55%, while commuter and express routes were down 95%. Next slide, please. These pie charts provide a quick snapshot of our operating and capital budgets and what those budgets are used to pay for. As you can see, our adopted pre-pandemic 2020 operating budget covering all metro service types was more than $460 million. All bus operations represent about 75% of our total operating budget. The capital improvement program pie chart represents a 6-year capital program of about $3.5 billion, but 83% of this 6-year CIP is represented by light rail transit and bus rapid transit development for large projects such as Southwest LRT, Bottineau, Orange Line, Gold Line, and then smaller ABRTs of D Line and B Line. The preservation wedge of the CIP chart represents the cost to keep existing assets in good repair. The expansion wedge includes the cost of new infrastructure and technology that go beyond state of good repair, other than, of course, the expansion of LRT and BRT projects. Next slide, please. Funding and governance go hand in hand, so this matrix displays the complexity of how service operations are financed across our service types. The subsidy for bus operations comes entirely from motor vehicle sales tax. Blue and Green Line are subsidized by both state appropriations and by county transit sales tax funding for counties where those services run. The same is true for North Star, except MnDOT also contributes 7% through the motor vehicle sales tax revenues that are dedicated to Greater Minnesota. Current state statute requires that the state not contribute to the operating or capital subsidies of the Green Line extension, the Southwest, in other words, the Southwest LRT. So the counties in the future will pay the subsidized share of the operating costs. I think to the question about how much of our money is federal, it really depends on the year and whether we have CMAQ grants that apply to operating costs. But I'm not showing federal dollars here because it's so small. I think the last operating budget was about 1% to 2% of our operating, and it was a function of certain grants that we had received from the federal that were unique to certain projects that we had. Next slide, please. For the sake of time, I'll not walk through this matrix, but once again, the takeaway here is the same. It's the complexity of our financing structures across our programs. It varies significantly across each type of development, each type of, for bus, it's primarily federal and RTC, but for Green Line, Blue Line, North Star, ABRT, and others, they really vary by funding stream and by decisions made by the legislature and federal government. In total, our federal participation in our CIP really varies significantly, again, from year to year, based upon the projects that are in the CIP. I think our 20 to 25 CIP shows in the neighborhood of about 60% federal money, because we have the Southwest program and we have Botno in that. As another example, for when we're purchasing buses, that's 80% federal money. When we have other small federal projects, it's typically 80% federal money with the rest with RTC bonds. So it can vary. The federal participation varies from year to year, and currently it's about 60-40, federal being 60 in our current capital program. Next slide, please. This is just a representation of examples of relationships we have with other divisions of the Metropolitan Council. We work with MTS on a number of issues, including the development of the Transportation Policy Plan, highway and transitway studies, service development plans, and ridership efficiency between fixed routes, route transit, transit link, and metro mobility. With community development, we partner with HRA, connecting people with homes who are using transit as shelter. This has been a very important partnership to us. The HRA received vouchers that are dedicated specifically to people using transit as shelter, and I think we've placed over 100 individuals into permanent housing as a result of that partnership, and we have potential to replace many more. We also work with community development in the review of comprehensive plans for their continuity with transit service and the transportation policy plans, and also participate in groups and in advisory committees on the issuance of grants for privately led transit-oriented development projects. With ES, we often work to coordinate our projects so that if ES needs to do work while we have the ground open up for some of our construction projects, they're able to do that, and vice versa. Regional administration provides Metro Transit with the support operations functions, including human resources, procurement, technology, legal services, risk management, bond issuances, and other financial services, as well as small business and diversified business contracting. So I tried to speak really quickly, and I'm take any questions that you have.
I know. All right, any questions? Going through my people boxes here. Jerry.
Yeah, and just a quick question, Wes. In one map, you show some purple area where you mentioned that those are opt-out services. Can you explain a little bit of that?
Well, yeah. Madam Chair and Jerry, I can leave this to Nick, but the opt-out services are those areas that have chosen to not participate in Metro Transit transit services. There was a point in time where areas could opt out of Metro Transit services, and those are the areas that did that. So with the exception of Maple Grove, who contracts with us, even though they're an opt-out, the other areas primarily manage the services, but contract with other transit vendors to deliver the services.
And that means they do not need to contribute money to this program, right? Since they are not using that part of the service.
Madam Chair, I'm not sure I understand that question.
Well, I think that the fund, he's getting at the funding, I believe.
Yep.
So if you're within the heavy black area, you pay into a capital transit tax. But the opt-outs are funded as a portion of the motor vehicle sales tax that's collected on vehicle registrations statewide. So they just run, there's like Minnesota Valley Transit Authority, Southwest Transit. They run independent operations that feed into and complement Metro Transit services.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I could just take it a step further to say their operations are financed by motor vehicle sales, share of motor vehicle sales tax, and their rolling stock is purchased by the Metropolitan Council. So their buses are purchased by the Metropolitan Council, although they're required to maintain them.
Any other questions for Wes at this point? Okay. All right, thank you very much. Next up, I think we have Lisa.
Good afternoon. Starting out here with environmental services, I think I can go through this pretty fast.
That would be great.
As you can see here, our key role is to operate the wastewater treatment system, but we also do water supply planning and surface water planning. And those three things help us protect the public and the environment and make sure we can economically expand and grow in our region. Next slide. So as you might guess, our system's pretty big, given the fact that we have half of the state being served with our wastewater treatment system. We have $7 billion in infrastructure, and that provides a really reliable service for the region and at a rate that's about 40% less than other peer organizations across the country. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of where our revenue comes from, 78% of it comes from wastewater charges to the communities, who then pass that fee along to their homeowners, and that's based on flow. So it's a percentage of that community's flow of the entire region. And then we also have a second source of revenue, which is a sewer availability charge, and that's the charge capacity for a portion of our system that was built before it was needed so that it would be ready to serve future capacity. So it's basically the debt service on our reserve capacity. A third source of revenue is the industrial waste charges. And we have 800 industries that we permit. This fee covers the cost, the administrative cost of that, as well as the fees for treating their waste. Next slide. This shows how we fit in the family of the Met Council, focusing on the right three. We have local comprehensive sewer plans that ensure that we'll be ready to serve those communities and that they'll be able to be done efficiently. And then we also have the Metropolitan Area Master Water Supply Plan that we do in conjunction with the Department of Natural Resources. And we also do water resource planning, and we do that with Board of Water and Soil Resources, along with the watershed organizations that are in the region. This is where it all comes together. We publish the Water Resources Policy Plan, and that's where the communities can look to see what capacity we're ready to serve. And it's based on their plans in the comprehensive plans that they submit. And that's all done to design a system that will be ensured that it can protect the public health and the environment, as well as serve the capacity of growth that was planned. Next slide. Although the region is relatively water rich, the region's steady population growth, increased groundwater pumping that's going along with that growth, changing land use, and then the variable weather and climate changes that are challenging communities is making the future and our ability to meet the future water supply demands more challenging. So with the overarching goal of sustainable water supply now and in the future, Environmental Services provides support for collaboration with many communities and water-related partners in the region and state. Next slide. Since 2014, ES is focused on strengthening their collaboration support to fulfill the requirement of the 2005 Minnesota Statute 473-1565. We work with the Metropolitan Area Water Supply Advisory Committee for development of the Water Supply Master Plan. We are also working with a growing number of communities that have formed sub-regional groups to address their local water supply planning needs. The level of engagement has grown, and we anticipate that it will continue to grow as the benefits of the collaborations are demonstrated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions on environmental services? There we go. Now I can see everybody.
I've got a question.
Mr.
Madam
Bell,
Chair.
I believe. I don't see you, but I think that's your voice.
That is my voice. Thank you. Lisa, how do we price the industrial treatment that we do? Do we make a profit on that?
Our goal is to make sure we recoup all the costs of that program. So we charge based on the strength. So there's a strength component to what we think the cost will be to actually treat their flow. And we monitor that in order to make sure that the charges line up with what they're sending us. We also monitor it to make sure that they're not discharging anything that's not allowed by the EPA standards. So we've been delegated that authority that lots of states do through what we have as the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And we've also made sure that the costs of overseeing that program is recovered. And that's something that we've ensured in the last 15 years. Before that, I don't think that we were recouping all the administrative costs like we needed to. And we've now moved into making sure. So there was several years where we had to adjust higher rate increases for them than just the strength charges would be. But we've made progress.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Thank you very much. Now I think we're going back to Lisa for a quick presentation on our peer regions. And there's a lot of information in her presentation and not much time. So I think we just have a brief overview. And then if any of the members want to dive deeper to any of these regions and get more information on the various models being presented, we can certainly do that for a future meeting. So Lisa.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair. Getting a little bit of echo there. So actually, I think I'll probably spend most of the time on this slide, and then we'll skip through really quickly. But just some definition baseline setting here is that what you'll see pretty commonly referred to in regional governance are a whole soup of acronyms, councils of governments, metropolitan planning organizations, which I'm sure most of you are most familiar with, regional development authorities, and regional planning agencies. These all have very different meanings associated with them, as is noted on this slide, so I won't spend too much time with them. But some of them are, like MPOs, are laid out in federal law about what their responsibilities are, whereas items like the Regional Development Authority and regional planning agencies are often allowed for under specific state laws. So different states will have different authorities that these types of agencies can have. And even more specifically, in certain types of regional governments, they may just toss all of these things all together and create their own type of model. So there are all of these elements. Councils of government are probably the most commonly used type of organization for a regional government model, and you can see it for a variety of different types of issues, and it usually plays a coordinating role or addresses especially because it's so common, a singular regional issue, whether it's transportation or where I used to work in greater Minnesota, there was a COG just for bridges across the rivers to serve the specific communities that straddled that particular river. So that's all it was, a regional cog for bridges. So those can have a variety of different roles and responsibilities, all 4 of these, but these 4 different types of models are the things you will see most commonly, especially amongst our peer regions. Next slide, please. What you'll see in regional governance in practice is that nobody is really just one of these things, especially in larger metropolitan areas. Larger metropolitan areas may have a primary regional government that covers many of the items, but then have several other types of bodies that are either voluntary collaborations or coordinations or other agencies that operate independently, like a transit authority or a port authority that are allowed for or delegated authority through state or federal statutes. Some regions are entirely voluntary in their planning and transportation coordination, but most regions, especially those that we often compare ourselves to, are some combination of both voluntary efforts and state and federal delegated authority. Next slide, please. So in the handout that we also posted with today's agenda, there are 7 peer region examples, and we tried to select the ones that were either most like us in that they, like Portland, were often compared to because they are a specific government entity that is designated by statute with specific authorities. Or other regions that we are similar in size and population or have a similar makeup, or because they're close to us like Chicago. So just to give a variety of sense of scale as well as sense and range of responsibilities. Next slide, please. And just to summarize, this is a lot of information, but on the handout I provided as well that included all 7 agencies, including the council, it really is organized to show both the types of models that it uses in the organization of its agency, whether it's voluntary or created in state law, who the representatives are and how they are selected or appointed. And then very generally, these areas of responsibility, ranging from transportation to land use or growth management, housing, parks, and et cetera. There are such a wide range of things. I really tried to summarize to the best of my abilities without giving you all a 75-page report. You could easily do a graduate dissertation on regional governance. In these columns of areas of responsibility, you'll see a P, which stands for policy making, and an O, which stands for operations. So you'll see that some agencies like Portland Metro have a lot of operational responsibilities, and in their case, they also operate the Portland Zoo, things that we don't do at the council. But there, you will also see that in the handout, a number of different agencies have responsibility for different things. Some of the state designated agencies like Boston, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, are actually specifically formed to coordinate regional advocacy for issues and propose legislation. So have a variety of different roles and responsibilities. In the table, I also included a summary of the geography that the governance structure covers, as well as estimated population from the most recently available data. So you will see that there is a lot of variety, even in just the geography that's covered, even in metro areas that are similar in size to us. And for some of those agencies, like the Denver Region Council of Governments, the geography can vary from topic to topic, depending on who's in on a certain topic, whether it's transportation or water. And it can also vary from year to year because it's voluntary. So cities can opt out in any given year or opt in any given year as well. Although for the most part, in some of these larger regions, the bulk of the population or communities that represent the bulk of the population stay consistent from year to year. So I won't go into all of the details, but I have provided a significant amount of information for you all to digest, really to be as a baseline to see how does the council compare, the council's governance structure and model compare to other regions, both in our setup and structure, but also in our area and areas of responsibilities. And I know we're short on time, so I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Any quick questions on this note? there's lots there. And if people want to do some homework, if there's a particular model or region you want us to dive deeper into, we can certainly do that. Looking ahead, what we thought we would do is at the next meeting on the 28th of September, look at MPOs, have MnDOT present how they run the other MPOs in the rest of the state. So how are we alike or different in how that issue is handled with federal money across the state of Minnesota, and how we do it here in the metro. And then on the 12th of October, look at the regional transit governance, how that's set up, look at the legislative auditor's report from a couple of years ago. And then the last meeting in October, getting interested parties, those groups that have made proposals on Met Council reform in the past. There was a suburban counties group, Metro Cities has done some work in this area, and that meeting on the 26th, we'd invite local, the Citizens League had a working group. We would invite those types of organizations to present to the committee at that point. And then that would consume the first 4 meeting agendas. So any thoughts or input? There was a bunch of written materials, and I'm not sure if they were sent out to all the committee members. Judd, did you send all those reports out, kind of that homework packet, or?
I did. Links. Sorry. Little feedback here. I did send links to a variety of reports. I know there was a couple from the Citizens League, the Legislative Auditors Report we had from the Metro Transparency Group, I believe, and I think we may even had one from the Center for the American Experiment. But I did send links to all that probably about a week ago, so it should be in your email.
And there will not be a test. So
It's over 600 pages.
For those of you that want to read, review, you know, it's just provided as background material. If there are additional materials that you think the committee members should have access to, let us know. We'd be, you know, more than happy to send more of this out. It's my understanding that eventually links to these studies will also be on the website for the committee, so members of the public will have access to that same information that we're looking at as well. So any other questions, comments? I'm sorry that we were short on time for discussion this time, but I want to end on time. But if there's anything else that we need to know, please let us know. Judd?
I just want to let everybody know that I did send out budget slides that relate to our operating budget and sources of funds. So there's slides and there's also the actual budget document. And if folks have questions in between the meetings or things that they'd like to have information on, please send me those questions and I will be happy to follow up with you and with the group, because I do know that time is always going to be a crunch for us. And so I want to make sure that you have access to as much information you want and the people who can provide that information. So just don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Mayor Hovland.
Just wanted to double check here now. Do we have all of the PowerPoint presentations that were made today? Did you send those out earlier in their totality?
They were sent out in an email earlier today, and we're trying to do that to get them out ahead of time, and then they'll be posted with the reading materials on the website as well. So if you find it easier to just go to a website and look at them as opposed to scrolling through dozens of emails, they'll be there as well.
I know I should have been reading all of that instead of playing in the Rotary Charity Golf Tournament this morning. All right. Good to see you all.
All right. Anything else? And don't hesitate to contact me in the meantime if there's something that you think we need to be doing. But other than that, everybody enjoy your Monday. Thank you. We're adjourned, I guess. Right? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
See you